Manhattan does not do quiet well. The city moves, rebuilds, demolishes, and replaces itself so fast that whole chapters of its history disappear before anyone thinks to write them down. But some places don't get replaced. They just sit there. Closed doors, boarded windows, leases that never got renewed. Here are 9 once iconic spots in Manhattan that are now empty. Spot 9. The Fillmore East, 105 2nd Avenue, East Village. The Fillmore East opened in March 1968 and closed in June 1971. 3 years and 3 months. That is the entire run of one of the most important music venues in American history, and it happened in a former Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue in the East Village that seated fewer than 2,700 people. Bill Graham, who already ran the Fillmore West in San Francisco, took over the space in 1968 and turned it into the East Coast anchor of the psychedelic rock era. The list of artists who performed there reads like a syllabus for a course on late 1960s American music: Jimi Hendrix, The Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, the Allman Brothers Band, Jefferson Airplane, The Who, Led Zeppelin. The Allman Brothers recorded their landmark 1971 live album there, 2 nights in March of that year, just months before the venue closed for good. The building had been a theater since 1926, passing through various incarnations before Graham arrived. He spent $250,000 renovating it, installing a state-of-the-art sound system and improving the sightlines. At the time, $250,000 was a serious investment for a rock venue. The acoustics were considered exceptional, and performers returned repeatedly because of them. Ticket prices at the Fillmore East were deliberately kept low. Graham believed the audience mattered as much as the performers, and that pricing out working-class New Yorkers would kill the culture he was trying to build. A ticket in 1968 cost between $2 and $4. Shows ran long. Triple bills were common, meaning an audience that paid $3 could spend 5 hours listening to music. The model was not especially profitable, which may explain why it lasted only 3 years. Graham had a reputation as a difficult man to work with, demanding, blunt, occasionally furious, but also as someone who genuinely cared about the quality of the experience he was presenting. Light shows, high-quality sound engineering, and attention to the physical comfort of the audience were all priorities that other promoters of the era did not share to the same degree. The Fillmore East was not the only rock venue in New York in the late 1960s, but it was the one that performers remembered most clearly when asked about it decades later. Graham closed the Fillmore East on June 27, 1971, citing rising costs and what he described as a changed culture around live music. The closing concerts ran for several nights and drew enormous crowds. After it closed, the building was briefly used as a nightclub, then stood largely empty for years. By the mid-1970s, the block had deteriorated significantly, along with much of the East Village. The building was eventually converted, first into a bank, then into a pharmacy and retail space. The exterior stonework remains largely intact. The marquee is gone. There is no historical marker outside. The address at 105 2nd Avenue is today a CVS pharmacy. The space where Hendrix played is now where people pick up their prescriptions. New York is many things, but subtle is not one of them. Spot 8. Luchow's Restaurant, 110 East 14th Street, Union Square. Luchow's opened in 1882 and was, for nearly a century, one of the most celebrated German restaurants in the United States. August Luchow, a German immigrant who had worked as a waiter, bought the original space near Union Square with a loan from William Steinway, yes, of the piano family, who had become a regular customer. Steinway's money helped establish what would become a Manhattan institution. The restaurant became a gathering place for the city's artistic and intellectual elite almost immediately. Lillian Russell dined there. Diamond Jim Brady was a regular. Enrico Caruso came frequently. Mark Twain held court at a corner table. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, Luchow's was the kind of place where the worlds of music, theater, money, and politics overlapped in a single dining room decorated with hunting trophies and dark wood paneling. The food was traditional German: sauerbraten, Wiener Schnitzel, roasted goose during the holidays. Enormous portions served in an atmosphere of controlled grandeur. The beer garden in the back was legendary. During Prohibition, Luchow's navigated the period with a combination of creativity and connections that kept the place functioning when many of its competitors did not. The decline came gradually. The neighborhood around Union Square deteriorated through the 1960s and 1970s, and the clientele that had sustained Luchow's for decades began to drift elsewhere. The restaurant changed ownership multiple times. In 1982, exactly 100 years after it opened, it relocated from its original building to a new space on West 49th Street in an attempt to chase a more commercially viable location. The move failed. Luchow's closed permanently in 1986. The original building on East 14th Street was demolished. The block is now a chain retail corridor, as anonymous as any other stretch of Lower Midtown. Nothing marks the spot where Steinway, Caruso, and Twain once shared the same room on a winter evening, which in New York is not unusual. The city has always been better at building the future than preserving the evidence of the past. Spot 7. The Savoy Ballroom, 596 Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The Savoy Ballroom opened on March 12, 1926, and for nearly 30 years, it was the premier dance hall in Harlem and arguably the most influential dance venue in American history. It occupied the entire second floor of a block-long building on Lenox Avenue between 141st and 141st Streets, a space that held between 4,000 and 5,000 people on a busy night, with 2 bandstands so that music never stopped between sets. The Savoy was racially integrated from the beginning, which was not common in 1926, and the policy was enforced. White and black dancers shared the floor every night. White patrons came up from downtown specifically to dance at the Savoy, which became a point of cultural tension with some Harlem community leaders, who felt the neighborhood's premier venue was being overrun by outsiders. The management walked a complicated line for decades. The Lindy Hop, the dance form that would become the template for swing dancing across America and eventually the world, was developed on the Savoy's floor. Frankie Manning, who became the most famous Lindy Hop dancer in history, learned and refined the style there beginning in the late 1920s. When Benny Goodman's band played Carnegie Hall in January 1938 in the concert widely credited with bringing swing to mainstream white America, members of the Savoy's dance community were in the audience. Chick Webb led the house band for years. Ella Fitzgerald got her start performing with Webb's orchestra, and she continued performing at the Savoy long after she became a star in her own right. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and Cab Calloway all performed there regularly. The Savoy closed in 1958. The building was demolished the following year to make way for a public housing development, the Delano Village Apartments, later renamed Savoy Park, which still stands on the site today. A small plaque on the exterior of the building acknowledges what stood there before, but the plaque is easy to miss and rarely noticed by the residents walking past it. The closing of the Savoy is often cited alongside the demolition of Pennsylvania Station as one of the great losses in New York's 20th century history, 2 landmarks erased in the same general period, both for reasons that seem, in retrospect, hard to defend. What makes the Savoy's loss particularly difficult to absorb is that it was not destroyed by neglect or economic failure. It was thriving when it closed. The decision to tear it down was a city planning choice, a preference for new housing stock over a functioning cultural institution that had been operating for 32 years. The city got the housing. The Lindy Hop moved to other floors. The specific energy of the Savoy, which every dancer and musician who passed through it tried to describe, and none of them quite could, disappeared with the building. Spot 6. Horn and Hardart Automat. Multiple locations, last at 200 East 42nd Street. The Horn and Hardart Automat was not a single location, it was an empire. At its peak in the 1950s, the chain operated more than 50 automats in New York City, feeding an estimated 800,000 people a day. The concept was straightforward. Food displayed behind small glass windows, each one operated by a nickel in the slot. You dropped your coins, turned the handle, and retrieved your meal. No waitstaff, No tipping, no conversation required. Just food, coffee, and the mechanical dignity of a transaction that asked nothing of you. The first Horn and Hardart in New York opened in 1912 on Broadway. Joseph Horn and Frank Hardart had already been running the concept in Philadelphia since 1902, and they brought it north. After proving the model worked, the Automats spread quickly through Manhattan, becoming fixtures in Midtown particularly, where they fed office workers, theater goers, and anyone who wanted a clean, cheap meal in a room that did not feel cheap. The coffee dispensed from dolphin head spigots became famous in its own right. Horn and Hardart roasted their own beans and were considered by many regulars to serve the best cup of coffee available in the city at any price. Former patrons still talk about it. The macaroni and cheese was iconic. The pies were baked fresh daily. The quality was genuine. And the egalitarianism of the format, a banker and a stenographer getting the same meal from the same window, was a specific kind of New York democratic experience that has not been replicated. The decline began in the 1950s as fast food chains expanded and the economics of the Automat model became difficult to sustain. Inflation made the nickel-in-the-slot format increasingly awkward. Retrofitting the machines for dimes and quarters changed the experience, and more importantly, changed the psychology of it. The Automat's appeal was partly mechanical, the satisfying click of the window, the coins, the handle, and partly social. When the price points rose and the novelty faded, the format no longer felt like a bargain and no longer felt like magic. It just felt like a cafeteria. Horn and Hardart tried various adaptations through the 1960s and 1970s, including converting some locations to more conventional cafeteria service and experimenting with updated menus. None of it arrested the decline. The company that had fed nearly 1 million New Yorkers a day in the 1950s was operating just a handful of locations by the 1980s, and each closing drew small, quiet crowds of people who had been going to the same window for 30 years and did not quite know what to do with that. The last Horn and Hardart Automat in New York closed on April 2, 1991, at 200 East 42nd Street, near Grand Central. A small crowd gathered outside. Several former employees and longtime regulars attended. The space became a Burger King. The dolphin head coffee spigots, the chrome and glass windows, and the particular hum of 800,000 people being fed without anyone having to speak to anyone. All of it gone. As writer E.B. White, who was a regular, described the Automat in his 1949 essay Here is New York, it was the city's unself-conscious version of the Agora. That is probably the most generous thing anyone has ever said about a cafeteria, and it was entirely deserved. Spot 5. The original Penn Station, 8th Avenue between 31st and 33rd Streets. The original Pennsylvania station opened on September 8, 1910, and was demolished beginning in October 1963. What stood in between was 53 years of one of the finest pieces of public architecture in the United States. And what came after was the event that effectively created the American Historic Preservation Movement. McKim, Mead, and White designed it. The main waiting room was modeled on the tepidarium of the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, a vaulted concourse with 150-foot ceilings, travertine walls, and natural light flooding through enormous arched windows. The concourse where passengers boarded their trains was covered with a glass and iron canopy that allowed daylight to reach the platforms. The whole complex covered 8 city blocks and processed 100 million passengers a year by its peak. The Pennsylvania Railroad, which owned the station, was struggling financially by the early 1960s. The maintenance costs for the building were enormous, and the railroad's real estate holdings were worth far more as development sites than as architecture. In 1961, the railroad announced plans to demolish the station and lease the air rights to a developer who would build a sports arena above the tracks, which became Madison Square Garden, while relocating the passenger facilities underground. The reaction was immediate and furious. The New York Times editorial board called it a monumental act of vandalism. Architects, preservationists, and ordinary New Yorkers protested outside the building with signs that read, "Don't amputate, renovate." None of it mattered. Demolition began in October 1963 and was completed in 1966. The stone eagles that had stood at the building's entrances were trucked to a rail yard in New Jersey, where many of them still sit in a field. Workers who helped with the demolition later described the job as deeply uncomfortable, not physically, but in the way that dismantling something magnificent tends to feel when you are the one holding the tools. The architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable, writing in the Times as the wrecking ball swung, put it plainly, "We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed." The demolition of Penn Station directly led to the Landmarks Preservation Law of 1965, which created the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and gave the city legal tools to protect significant structures. Grand Central Terminal, threatened with a similar fate a few years later, was saved in part because Penn Station had already been lost. What sits beneath Madison Square Garden today, the current Penn Station, a low-ceilinged, fluorescent-lit warren of corridors and platforms, is widely considered the worst major transit hub in the United States. Spot 4. The Latin Quarter Nightclub, 200 West 48th Street, Midtown. The Latin Quarter opened in 1942 at 200 West 48th Street and operated as one of New York's most successful supper clubs through the 1960s. Lew Walters, father of broadcast journalist Barbara Walters, owned and ran it. The format was classic mid-century nightclub, a floor show with showgirls, a full orchestra, a headlining comedian or singer, dinner served to tables arranged around a central stage, and a 2-drink minimum that kept the revenue flowing. The club seated around 700 people and was consistently full during its peak years. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis performed there early in their partnership. Sophie Tucker played the room. Jimmy Durante was a regular headliner. Frank Sinatra appeared. Durante in particular became so associated with the Latin Quarter that his presence became part of the venue's identity, the room where you went on a Saturday night and had the specific experience of New York nightlife that people came to the city expecting. The supper club format as a business model depended on a particular kind of audience, people who dressed for dinner, expected a floor show, and were willing to pay premium prices for the combination of food, entertainment, and atmosphere. That audience began shrinking in the 1960s as television brought entertainment into the home, and younger audiences preferred different formats, rock clubs, discotheques, and eventually the downtown scene pulled attention and money away from the traditional supper club circuit. Lew Walters himself had complicated finances throughout much of his career. The Latin Quarter was his biggest success, but it came with the pressures of running a large operation with nightly payroll for performers, orchestra musicians, kitchen staff, and a showgirl review that required costumes, choreography, and constant renewal to stay fresh. The margins in a business where the headline act demands a significant fee and the kitchen has to feed 700 people competitively were never comfortable, and Walters spent years managing the gap between the club's glamorous image and its economic reality. The Latin Quarter closed in 1969. Lew Walters had already sold the club before the end, and the building went through several uses afterward. The block around West 48th Street, once part of the theater district's entertainment corridor, has been rebuilt and reconfigured multiple times since. Nothing at the current address suggests anything was there worth remembering. What the room looked like at its peak was specific enough that former patrons described it consistently for decades afterward. The tiered seating arranged so that every table had a sightline to the stage, the red and gold color scheme that read as glamorous under low light, the orchestra tucked into the pit, the showgirls in the wings. It was a room designed to make the person sitting in it feel like they were somewhere important. For the better part of 3 decades, they were. Spot 3, Roseland Ballroom, 239 West 52nd Street, Midtown. Roseland Ballroom opened in 1919 on Broadway and 51st Street, relocated to West 52nd Street in 1956, and finally closed on April 7, 2014, after 95 years of operation. It was the longest-running dance hall in American history, and by the time it closed, it had outlasted virtually every other venue of its kind by several decades. The original Roseland was a whites-only dance hall, which was the norm for mainstream commercial dance venues of the era. That changed over time, and by the post-World War II period, Roseland was open to all. The relocation to 52nd Street in 1956 put the venue in a building that would become its permanent home, a large, plain structure with a sprung wood floor that dancers praised for decades, a stage at one end, and a capacity of around 3,500 people. In its later years, Roseland operated as a concert venue as much as a dance hall. The capacity, the central Manhattan location, and the relative flexibility of the space made it useful for acts that were too large for clubs but not quite ready for arenas. Lady Gaga filmed her 2014 concert film there in the venue's final weeks. Madonna had performed there in the 1980s. The building's plain exterior gave no indication of what happened inside on any given night. The closing in 2014 was announced by owner Gerald Picher, who had operated the space for years, and who cited rising costs and the difficulty of sustaining a large entertainment venue in Midtown against escalating rents. The building was slated for redevelopment as a luxury residential tower. The sprung wood floor, which dancers had been writing about for decades, was dismantled. The site at 239 West 52nd Street is now part of a residential development. The address that once drew thousands of dancers every week is now an apartment building where residents presumably have no idea what was there before. Roseland's longevity was itself remarkable. It survived Prohibition, the Depression, World War II, the decline of the ballroom era, the rise of rock and roll, disco, and 3 decades of changing entertainment economics. What finally ended it was not cultural irrelevance. The venue was still drawing crowds in its final years, but the math of Manhattan real estate, which eventually makes the same argument to every building that is not a skyscraper. You are worth more as something else. The gap between what Roseland was at its peak and what replaced it is significant enough that it barely needs comment. A sprung dance floor that survived 95 years is now someone's lobby. Spot 2. The original Yankee Stadium, River Avenue and East 161st Street, the Bronx. The original Yankee Stadium sits in the Bronx, not Manhattan. And if that bothers you, consider that the stadium shaped this city's identity for 85 years, more directly than most buildings that physically stand on the island. Its absence registers the same way. It opened on April 18, 1923, with a crowd of 74,000 people and a home run by Babe Ruth. It closed on September 21, 2008, with a Yankees victory over the Baltimore Orioles. Between those two dates, 85 years passed, and more baseball history accumulated than at any other single address in American sports. The house that Ruth built was the common name, and Ruth was indeed the reason it existed. The Yankees needed a stadium that could contain the crowds drawn by Ruth's presence, and the Polo Grounds, which they shared with the Giants, could not do it. The original design by architects Osborne Engineering included 3 decks of seating and the famous copper frieze that ran around the roofline, which became the most recognized architectural detail in baseball. The stadium was renovated extensively between 1974 and 1976, with the Yankees playing at Shea Stadium during those 2 seasons. The renovation removed the original frieze and changed the dimensions of the outfield, which upset traditionalists considerably. What remained after the renovation was a modernized version of the original structure, functional but stripped of some of its character. When the new Yankee Stadium opened across the street in 2009, the old building was immediately surplus. The Yankees and the city had agreed that the old stadium would be demolished and the site converted to parkland. Heritage Field, a public park with baseball diamonds, opened on the site in 2012. The demolition was complete by 2010. The copper frieze was gone. The monuments to Ruth, Gehrig, DiMaggio, and Mantle that had stood in the outfield were relocated to the new stadium's Monument Park. Standing at Heritage Field today, there is nothing to indicate the specific dimensions of what was there. The grass is pleasant, the baseball diamonds are well maintained, children play there. It is an admirable use of urban land, and it preserves essentially nothing of what made the original site significant. Spot 1. Downing Stadium / Randall's Island Stadium. Randall's Island. Downing Stadium on Randall's Island opened in 1936 as part of the Robert Moses-era public works expansion that reshaped New York's parks and recreational infrastructure. It was built as a track and field facility with a capacity of around 22,000 and was used for athletic competitions, concerts, and various civic events over its 7 decades of operation. The stadium's history is more interesting for its cultural moments than for its athletics. In June 1988, Downing Stadium hosted a major Amnesty International concert that drew tens of thousands of people to Randall's Island on a summer evening. Reviewers described the crowd spilling across the bleachers and onto the grass infield, the Manhattan skyline visible across the water, the sound carrying over the East River. It was the kind of night people described for years afterward, not because of the performers specifically, but because of what the place did to the experience. Outdoor stadiums with water on 3 sides and a city skyline as the backdrop have an atmosphere that enclosed arenas cannot replicate, and Downing had it on good nights. Robert Moses had envisioned Randall's Island as a recreational center for the city, accessible via the bridges that connect it to Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx. The island was also home to institutions that reflected another side of Moses's approach to public planning. Facilities for people the city preferred to keep at a distance. The Manhattan Developmental Center, which housed people with intellectual disabilities, operated on the island for decades. The island's geography, are technically accessible but inconvenient enough to feel isolated, made it a useful location for things the city needed but did not want too visible. The stadium itself deteriorated steadily through the 1990s and into the 2000s. By the late 1990s, it was in genuinely poor condition. Crumbling infrastructure, decaying seating, a track surface that had not been properly maintained. The city condemned it in 2004 following structural assessments. A proposal to build a new stadium on the site for the 2012 Olympic bid, New York was a candidate city, was part of the rationale for tearing down the old one. New York did not get the 2012 Olympics. London did. The new stadium was never built. The site on Randall's Island was cleared, and the land has been used for various athletic facilities and park space, but no permanent stadium has replaced Downing. The island today has sports fields, a golf course, and facilities used by various city agencies. It is used, and it is functional, and it has none of the specific character that a stadium with a 7-decade history accumulates. The Arc of Downing Stadium, built during the New Deal, used for everything from track meets to rock concerts, condemned for a building that was never built, replaced by a golf course, is as good a summary as any of how New York has treated its 20th century public infrastructure. Manhattan has always consumed itself. Buildings go up, buildings come down. The city insists it has no time for sentiment and largely means it. What the places on this list have in common is not just that they closed, it's that most of what replaced them is demonstrably less interesting than what was there before. A pharmacy, where Hendrix played. A Burger King where 800,000 people ate in democratic silence. A lobby where dancers spent 95 years. These were not obscure places. They were not failures. Most of them were full of people right up until they weren't. The city replaced them anyway, because the city always has a reason to replace things, and the reasons usually involve money, and the money usually wins. The city keeps moving. That is both the point and the problem. If this gave you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe. There is no shortage of New York to cover.